That evening started like any other, but I had no idea it was about to spiral into something far more complex. Jerry's father had planned for him to accompany him on a weekend business trip as usual. However, at the last minute, I asked him to stay. It seemed like such a simple request at the time, but beneath the surface, an uneasy storm was quietly building, both in him and in me. The morning carried a strange tension. I stood in the kitchen, preparing coffee in near silence, while Jerry sat at the dining table, ostensibly working on his homework, yet his far-off gaze betrayed that his mind was elsewhere. I broke the quiet. "Jerry, can you hand me that coffee?" My voice came out softer than usual, almost hesitant, as he handed me the cup. My hand lingered on his for a moment too long. It was subtle, but deliberate. I looked at him, almost willing him to decipher the unspoken words between us. The silence grew heavier until I finally broke it again. "Since it's just us today, there are some things I think we need to talk about." My voice was calm, but inside, a storm raged. Jerry looked up, visibly confused. "What's going on, Esther? Why are you talking like this?" I smiled faintly, but it wasn't the warm smile he was used to. It felt like I was letting him peek into something I had kept hidden for too long. "Jerry, you're not a child anymore. You've grown, and lately, it feels like something has shifted between us." My words were measured, careful. Jerry shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly trying to process what I was saying. "Esther, maybe you're imagining things," he said with an uneasy chuckle, though his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice. "Don't you feel it too, Jerry? Something's changing. There's something between us." My words were barely above a whisper, yet they hung heavy in the air. He didn't answer immediately, and I could see the internal conflict written all over his face. Finally, he murmured, "Esther, this doesn't make sense. You're my dad's wife." I placed a hand on his shoulder, my touch both steady and unyielding. "We're not hurting anyone, Jerry. No one else needs to understand this. What matters is that we're honest with ourselves." My tone was calm, but the gravity of my words was impossible to ignore. We sat in the heavy silence that followed, the weight of unspoken emotions pressing down on both of us. The air between us was charged, and neither of us seemed able to escape its pull. We sat in the heavy silence that followed, the weight of unspoken emotions pressing down on both of us. The air between us was charged, thick with tension, neither of us daring to address aloud. The flickering light from the fireplace cast shadows that danced across the room, making the moment feel even more intimate and inescapable. Jerry shifted in his seat, his eyes fixed on the floor, as though avoiding my gaze might help him escape what we both felt. But I couldn't let it go, not this time. "Jerry," I said softly, breaking the silence. My voice wavered, carrying both uncertainty and determination. He looked up at me, his eyes searching mine for something, answers, perhaps, or reassurance that what we were feeling wasn't entirely wrong. "We can't keep pretending this isn't real," I continued, leaning slightly forward. My heart pounded in my chest, loud enough that I was sure he could hear it. "Esther," he began, his voice heavy with hesitation, whatever this is, it can't happen. It's wrong." I reached out, my hand trembling as it found his. "Then why does it feel so impossible to ignore?" I whispered, my thumb brushing against the back of his hand. His breath hitched, and for a moment, he didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers slowly curled around mine, hesitant but deliberate. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "But it scares me." I moved closer, my knees brushing against his. The proximity sent a jolt through me, a reminder of how dangerously close we were, both physically and emotionally. "Jerry, I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, maybe some things aren't meant to make sense. Maybe we just have to feel them. His gaze locked onto mine, and for a moment, it was as if the rest of the world had faded away. The only thing that existed was the space between us and the magnetic pull drawing us closer. Before I could stop myself, I leaned in. It was tentative at first, a soft, hesitant press of my lips against his. The moment stretched, fragile and electric, until I felt him respond. His hand came up to caress my cheek, his touch warm and grounding as he deepened the kiss. Time seemed to blur, the rain outside had quieted, leaving only the crackling of the fire and the sound of our unsteady breaths. Every kiss felt like a confession, a release of emotions we had tried so hard to suppress. Esther, he murmured against my lips, his voice laced with both longing and conflict, we shouldn't, but I can't stop. I don't want you to, I replied, my words coming out in a breathless rush. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us. The warmth of his body against mine was intoxicating, and I didn't want to think. All I knew was that I didn't want this moment to end. We moved to the couch, the world outside forgotten as we lost ourselves in each other. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered word felt like crossing a boundary we could never return from, yet neither of us could bring ourselves to stop. Hours passed like minutes, and by the time the fire had burned down to glowing embers, we were lying tangled together, the weight of what had just happened settling over us like a heavy blanket. I don't know what happens next, Jerry admitted, his voice quiet but steady. Neither do I said, running my fingers through his hair. But for now, let's just stay here. Just for tonight. For once, neither of us argued. Whatever the consequences, they could wait until morning. Tonight, we were lost in a world of our own making, a world where the lines we'd crossed didn't matter, and all that existed was us. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a golden glow over the living room. I sat on the couch, sipping my coffee and replaying the events of the night before. My mind raced, a chaotic tangle of guilt and undeniable desire. Jerry had retreated to his room before dawn, leaving me with nothing but the lingering warmth of his touch and the sound of his voice echoing in my head. I barely noticed the knock at the door until it came a second time, louder and more insistent. Jolted from my thoughts, I stood and walked to the door, opening it to find Clara, my oldest and closest friend. Her smile was bright and familiar, but as her eyes met mine, her brow furrowed. "Esther, you look like you've seen a ghost," Clara said, stepping inside and setting her bag on the counter. "Is everything okay?" I forced a smile, trying to shake off the haze of last night. "Just didn't sleep well," I lied, closing the door behind her. Clara, always the intuitive one, didn't seem convinced. She gave me a long, searching look, but didn't press the issue. Instead, she poured herself a cup of coffee and settled into a chair at the kitchen table. "Where's Jerry?" she asked casually, glancing toward the stairs. "In his room," I said, my voice tight. "Probably still asleep." Clara nodded, her gaze lingering on me. "You know, Esther, I've always admired how you've managed to keep things together after marrying Tom. Raising a stepson isn't easy, but you've done a great job." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, a stark reminder of the lines I'd crossed. I looked away, unable to meet her eyes. "Thanks, Clara," I said quietly. The conversation shifted, Clara chatting about work and the book club she'd recently joined, but my mind was elsewhere. An idea had begun to form, one I couldn't quite push away. Clara was beautiful, confident, and single, a far better match for Jerry than me. Later that evening, I found myself standing at Jerry's door, hesitating before knocking softly. He opened it almost immediately, his eyes meeting mine with a mix of apprehension and curiosity. "Can we talk?" I asked. He nodded, stepping aside to let me in. We sat on the edge of his bed, the space between us charged with unspoken tension. "Jerry," I began, my voice soft but steady, "I've been thinking about last night, about us, and as much as I want to believe this can work, it can't. Not like this." His jaw tightened, and he looked away, his hands clenched into fists. "You're going to pretend it didn't happen?" he asked, his voice sharp. "No," I said firmly. "I'm not pretending, but we need to find another way. Someone who can give you what you need without all the complications." He frowned, confusion flickering in his eyes. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about Clara," I said, my words tumbling out in a rush. "She's kind, she's understanding, and she already cares about you. Maybe dash." "Wait," he interrupted, his voice sharp. "Are you seriously suggesting I start something with your best friend?" "Yes," I said, meeting his gaze. "Because I want you to be happy, Jerry. And she can give you that, without the guilt, without the secrets." For a moment, he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. Later that night, when Clara returned for dinner, I set my plan in motion. The three of us sat around the table, the conversation flowing easily. I made sure to steer it toward Jerry, his interests, his ambitions, highlighting all the qualities I knew Clara would find endearing. As the evening went on, I noticed Clara stealing glances at Jerry, her cheeks flushing whenever their eyes met. Jerry, for his part, seemed to be playing along, his usual guarded demeanor softening under her attention. After dinner, I suggested we move to the living room. I poured Clara a glass of wine and sat beside her on the couch, subtly guiding the conversation toward more personal topics. "You know," I said, leaning toward her with a conspiratorial smile, "Jerry's been talking about wanting to learn how to cook. Maybe you could give him a few pointers? You've always been the best chef I know." Clara laughed, the sound light and genuine. "I'd be happy to. What do you say, Jerry?" He hesitated for a moment, then nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Sure, that sounds great." As the evening wore on, I excused myself, leaving them alone under the pretense of needing to check on something upstairs. I lingered at the top of the stairs, listening to their laughter drifting up from the living room. A pang of jealousy twisted in my chest, but I pushed it aside. This was for the best. When I returned, Clara was sitting closer to Jerry than before, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Their conversation had turned quieter, more intimate. I watched as Jerry leaned in, his voice low, his eyes fixed on hers. My heart ached, but I forced a smile. "You two seem to be hitting it off," I said, breaking the moment. Clara looked up, her cheeks flushing. "Jerry's easy to talk to," she said, her tone light but genuine. There was something about their connection, the way they shared these little glances and moments of understanding, that felt different. Clara laughed softly at something Jerry said, and I couldn't help but notice how easily they slipped into a rhythm. It was clear there was an openness between them, something that seemed to be drawing them closer. "Jerry, you've really grown up," Clara said, her smile warm and sincere. "I remember when you were just a little boy, running around this house." Jerry chuckled, a light blush spreading across his cheeks. "Time flies, huh," he said, looking down as if he were lost in his own thoughts. For a moment, I felt a pang in my chest, but I pushed it aside. This was natural, this was how things were supposed to be. Jerry was growing up, becoming his own person, and Clara, well, Clara was always there, a steady presence in our lives. But still, something felt different. I couldn't help but wonder if I was just imagining it. Jerry glanced at Clara, his eyes lingering on her for just a second too long. It was subtle, but I noticed. Clara, however, didn't seem to notice, her attention still on him as she smiled back. I stood up, clearing my throat to break the moment. I think I'm going to bed. It's been a long day, I said, trying to sound casual. Clara looked up, her eyes meeting mine with a trace of concern. Are you sure you're okay, Esther? I nodded, forcing a smile. Yeah, just tired. You two have a good night. As I turned to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were shifting between the three of us. There was something new in the air, something I couldn't quite define, but I knew it was there. And as I walked down the hallway, I couldn't help but wonder what tomorrow would bring.